Man, we got Hyroot and we got Emilio. How are we doing? Happy Sunday.
Emilio, it's good to see you. I know class has been terrible on Thursday. So, Emilio, you'll love this. I actually kept up high root until like 1 in the morning the other day, talking about money and like money Gnosticism. I wrote a paper, high root. I have it here. I'm trying to decide. I'm trying to decide if I want to call it like economic Gnosticism or dualism, because I think I need like a separate paper and then leading into the NFT stuff and the pricing mechanism. So, thank you for staying up all night the other day, high root. I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate you explaining this theory to me. It was very very interesting and insightful. Yeah, I think that economic Gnosticism is a nice sexy title, so I'd go with that. But yeah, no, I think you're right, man. I think your idea kills dualism once and for all.
Well, that's good. So, Emilio, we always were trying to kill that Cartesianism, dear. So, Emilio, so Mr. Fishman, Emilio and I have like wonderful conversations on economics and different things. And Emilio's magnificent, and I hope you're doing well, my friend. So, yeah, no, I mean, Emilio, we were kind of talking about to start before kind of getting into this problem. We talk about the difference between goods, services, and approaches or horizon. Oh, Thomas Jockin, look at that. And this kind of problem of how do you price a new way of seeing the world, or the environment that it would incubate your ability. Mr. Jockin, how are you doing, sir? You doing all right? Mr. Jockin, look at that beautiful person. And he's been teaching on Thursday. It's so good to see you, Thomas. I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing good. It's good to see everybody.
It's good to see you. So we're talking a little bit about economics. And one of the things we kind of talk about is how the current pricing mechanism is very good, generally, of pricing goods and services. But there's this interesting thing now where these like online communities are, say, gaining wisdom or philosophy or helping you see things. And it's almost like the problem of pricing either approaches to life or like wisdom, or say horizons. Philosophy, the term horizon is kind of a big thing. So how much value, for example, or how do you price a community that changes the way that you see the world in different things? And it's kind of interesting because there's a sense in which, say, people knew going to church was valuable. You would go to church or you go to mosque, and there would be a certain kind of way of seeing the world that was valuable. And so you would go and you would learn that, and you would say maybe be willing to put money toward the church to put into the offering plate or different things because you value that. But as you lose sociological givenness, and it is no longer, say, just given that, say, the church adds value to the society, or that, a religion or a philosophy or something like that adds value, there has to be a way to assent that it adds value, right? It has to kind of convince you that you should. But what is the pricing mechanism that one goes about doing that if it's just not part of the sociological given that, say, the church adds value to the society? Like, how do you price what it is doing? So the reason we talk about that is, as you know, Mr. Jock, you have like, other life, you have voice craft, you have stuff, all these different things that are there's kind of this question of economic viability and economic sustainability, and what's the right way to go about, say, raising funds to sustain said community or something like that. And I call this the kind of the pricing problem of approach. I keep going back between like approach or horizon or maybe platonic form of kitten. That might actually be good for the algorithm if we go for things like that. So it's like this idea of the pricing problems of goods, services, and approaches. And I was also saying that a way, and Hyroot and I were talking about this, is there's kind of a way in which we treat money still very dualistically. We think about like price and value, like your money is like there's the price and then there's the value, and they're kind of separate. And we don't think of them as kind of interrelating very much. Or we're like, oh, there's only price. Or we're like, oh, there's only value, as opposed to seeing them as having a relationship between the two. And how this also is problematic because we don't necessarily, hi, Michelle, think of price and value as separate when really they're never separate, or that they're always dialectically relating. And I kind of called this economic Gnosticism and different things. So that was something we were talking about the other evening with Mr. Fishman and different things like that. But I'm also curious, Mr. Jockin, about how teaching is going at your class, how that is going for you, how your work on potentially beauty and ethics. I know you had been thinking about that subject and all of those different topics. So those are some of the things that have been in the air.
By the way, my interest in philosophy originally came from a study in value
in
the first place.
So
that's actually why I think that one of my pet topics is value, because it's fundamental, because the question ultimately what motivates human behavior, right? In the study of commerce, it ultimately comes down to what's motivating the exchange of dollars or commerce, right? And value is usually what we use. And then that leads to just a question of what is this value? What is it? And it tends to be, which with schools of economics you're going to study, they come to the answer to that. But then it leads to what you're bringing up, Daniel, which is a lot of times it also is dependent on what's the criterion of judgment by the subjects. Because the idea of cultivating one's soul and how should one lives one's life, right? That's basically, if we can argue what religion is meant to do is help cultivate the soul to live a certain way. That's a very different conversation than I'm hungry and I want a cheeseburger today, right? So the utility value of the return of utility value for my dollars for cheeseburgers, right? Fulfill my hunger is very different from the question of how do I have a good life, which is a question of ethics, right? So that usually requires a different time scale reference. So usually your time preferencing has to scale out way bigger. That's almost always a criterion of wisdom, is that your time scales will going way bigger than the next second. It has to be. That's actually an open question in the ethics, by the way, in Aristotle. He says, what is the term of a happy life? Do we know? We won't really know until he's dead. And then he makes it's like a kind of positing, like, well, then also, like, it's not even just your death, it's the generations after you. So we can almost ask, you did not live a happy life unless your progeny lived a good life. Because of the questions of the idea of building a political state. The happiness of the man is not good enough. It's more divine if a whole city is happy versus one man. So the order of magnitude of time, not just time, but also whom was even the criterion of success. It's not even about one individual at that point when we look at the ethics. So that's also a huge question. It's that, and what number would you put on that?
Right.
If you just look at bodily health, the answer is unlimited, quite frankly. Basically, human beings are going to spend any money they possibly have to pay for health care.
That's right.
That's partly the moral dilemma and the political tension over this with healthcare is usually for human bodies, we think the number is unlimited. So if we think it's true for bodies, that should be even more so true for souls. If we have immortal souls that continue on even after we die, then the argument would go that that'd be even more so the case. So in short, but of course, the only people who actually know that fact are people beyond even having a great understanding of a soul being immortal. It's just the question, can your soul even be shaped, or should it be cared for like a physician? Which, by the way, St. Augustine talks a lot about that. You know, the church being a medical hospital, right? The idea, a lot of medical analogies for the soul, for related to the body, using analogies like that. You would have enough wisdom to even understand that's a criterion, that your time scale and time preference could even be of worth of your attention. And then the question is, how much do you pay for it? Well, the short answer is, it is actually very similar to physical training in that way, right? In the sense that, you know, you can hire a trainer, but that doesn't mean you're going to be healthy. You got to do the work. You have to eat the food. You have to work out. You know, trainers can guide you and give you understanding and knowledge and how to cultivate one's body, but you still got to do the work. I would think for the soul, it's no different. Probably the same points, and a lot harder. So it actually also, it's almost like it's actually in a similar way. Kind of, you got to pay for something that's like incredibly unpleasurable in one domain. Maybe after a certain cultivation of your soul, you actually enjoy it. That's why people who love going to voice craft or, you know, Other Life, for example, or Indie Thinkers, or everything we do together in this group. You know, we're kind of unusual people, but we're choosing, from an economic point of view, we're choosing in our leisure time to cultivate our souls and our thinking and our minds, for example. That's a very unusual thing. Most people are going to play video games. Right. Like, it's just like, that's kind of how this goes, usually, in terms of what people choose to do by their time preferencing and what they choose to trade their time for value, right? So again, they kind of all dries in again. So the last note just kind of Daniel brought up is I'm being asked to give a course on the beautiful and virtue. So I actually chose to focus on Plato. So I think it's an area I want to talk about for a long time. Plato, I think even more than Aristotle, really thinks beauty is one of the vehicles for knowledge and actually cultivating the soul to love and desire virtue in the first place and try to enact it. So it's an area I'm actually really curious about. to explore and talk more about in the future. But anyways, so I'm going to hand it off because Daniel kind of threw me everything. So now I'm just going to throw it back off to everybody else.
No, I think that's excellent. And then whoever wants to speak, I think it is extremely important to follow the thread from the question of values
in kind of an ethical sense. Oh, we are going to get to harass Herrera. Oh, that's great. We're going to harass Javier. I think it's so important to see how the thread of values kind of leads into the economic question of valuing. And you see, around the time of this, the way I kind of think about it is what kind of happened at the Scottish Enlightenment. The thinking of value got kind of, with the Scots, went in the direction of economics, and that's where we took questions of motivation and David Hume, Ricardo, Hutchinson, all these different people. Whereas following Kant, more on the continent of the Enlightenment, value then was separated from its economic meaning or its economic potential, or it became two different uses and not really seeing a connection between the two. And that's when you had the kind of split and you ended up sort of dualism and different things. But you see, when you're talking about like on this sort of notion that price is relative to value, if I value my health, well, there's really no price I won't pay for it, right? And let's say, though, I value 1988 G.I. Joe collectibles. I might be willing to pay thousands of dollars for them, while everyone else here will think I'm an idiot. Like, why in the world would you pay $10,000? Well, for some reason, I see a value in that thus raises the price, right? Well, then there's some sort of intrinsic desire or intrinsic drive that makes me willing to do that price. And I see the value in it that other people may not meet the condition of seeing that value in. Therefore, price and value are always connected together. But the value of the thing is tied to the values cultivated in me. They're not so separated, right? And another, I was talking to Hiroot, and it's kind of like there's a way to, so there's like three ways that generally this works. One, I'm in a world in which I observe that a pipe is broken. Okay, so in facticity, I see that a pipe is broken. Therefore, there is now value to get a pipe that works, right? Because the facticity gives it to me. So it's external. There's an external fact that then gives me the notion that I need to fix the pipe. Okay. Then there's the going to the store and seeing a $20 for the trinket. And I say, oh, the value of that thing must be $20 because the price is $20, right? Now that's a kind of fallacy, but I make a deduction, a guess on what I think the value of the thing is based on the price. So then I observe the world and I conclude what the value is from there. So it's that they kind of go more so together. But the third one is, say, where I come to a net conversation and there is no price, but I decide there is value here from sort of an intrinsic drive, like you were saying, on the cultivation of a soul, right? So in there's an intrinsic, there's something intrinsic that is then moved to the external, right? Like I'm putting it on an external and saying there's a value here for X, Y, and Z reason. And I found out like a few months ago that the British say Z, not Z. And now it all made sense because for all these years I'd heard people say X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, why do they say Z? Did I not learn something in school? I don't know. Oh, it's a British thing. Just like they don't use Z's when there's like S's in America. Oh, that confuses me every time. But anyway, so the interesting thing is generally the pricing mechanism, the system of pricing tends to be fairly good when it comes to determining how much a pipe should be, how much a new pipe should be because there's a broken pipe. It also can give you a way of arranging things based on the price at a store, and you do the pricing system and hike and all that different things. But what's interesting is how do you price something like the net or voice crack or something where a soul is saying that there's a cultivation here that is worth doing, right? What is the mechanism of investment that could then make something that cultivates approaches or horizons enter into a pricing mechanism system? Generally, right now, a lot of people are in the business of, say, donations or offering or crowdfund or things like that. But it's a very tricky economic problem. And the reason Hiroot was forced to stay up till 2 a.m. with poor Cam is we ended up talking about those different questions. But the main thread I want to touch on, without getting into that, but we can't get into that, is this notion of the connection of economic value or values that have economic consequences and an internal valuation that is cultivated through the moral life or ethics or some sort of training, of which then based on that valuation, that may impact what you're willing to pay. Like you might actually be willing to pay, say, $100 for a collection of books if you think that those books will cultivate your soul, right? Whereas someone else may not be willing to pay that price because they don't agree to the premise that those books can help cultivate their soul in some positive way, right? And so one's valuation is going to impact the prices that they're willing to have. But I think we've kind of completely lost sight of the connection between the ethical values and the economic values, when really they kind of follow one another, or they're always dialectically relating to one another, or that they're tied together. And I think that also does get into the beauty, because when you experience something beautiful, there's a sense that that is beautiful. Like that is valuable. That thing right there is valuable. You just apprehend it, even if you can't necessarily put it into words, or it sort of catches you as being valuable. And then the other reason that's interesting is because economics is so much in the business of motivation. And there's something about seeing something as valuable in the world that therefore motivates you to experience more of it, or to want more of it. And it's almost like what you're trying to do, or in a sense, it's almost like with money, you're trying to simulate that experience of the encounter of the beautiful, or the encountering of something that then motivates you, and figuring out a way to kind of simulate that at a lower resolution in regard to currency and money, where you like, oh, you see this and then you want it, and therefore motivates you. It's like a low-res simulation of that. So those are some thoughts I had. Javier, I wanted to talk about the impossibility of the event experience, the impossibility of speaking failure, impossibility. The name of the game is to say impossibility as many times as possible. The French deconstructionists love this. So those are generally some thoughts.
Thanks, Daniel. It's a really interesting topic, the one that you say, like the value and the price and everything. Like the thing that came popping up with me is that it's weird, like value and price. I agree, because the more I think about it, it kind of like falls down, because, for example, you say like someone might value a book collection for $100, right? But you would only be willing or would be able to pay that if, depending on what you earn, right? Like, for example, for a millionaire, like that might be like $100 would be worth like anything, because it's so little money, right? So also like the pricing mechanism it's relative, yeah, to the internal, because you would say like, oh yeah, I would spend like all my savings on this book collection that it's $100, but also the price is weird, because the price in a sense is kind of social, because someone else can pay $100 like without no problem. So it's weird, the type of the situations, because it is like the internal motivation it's individual, but the price becomes a social thing, right? So like some people like might not value it the same, like might not value the books that much, but they are rich, so they will just pay them, right? So it's an interesting juxtaposition. And for me, it's like money is really interesting. It's like a fantastic tool for like social coordination, because in a way it lets you like save up like human time and energy, because like if you have money but you're in the middle of the forest, like money doesn't really work. It's kind of a social technology, right? So basically, when you have money, you're paying for time or resources that another person set up or actually like spend it, right? Like you're paying for the work, the hours of work, like of a worker, or maybe you're paying for someone that came up with a new machine that set up something, and that makes it really cheap to produce shoes or something. So you're always paying for this social aspect. So like it's weird, because money is this tool to coordinate. I can give you like $10, and that means that you can exchange it for other things. So I think it's a really good coordination tool. But the more I think about it, price is like, I'm not sure, but the more I think about it, price is not. It is related to value in a sense, but I think it's its own thing, because always when you're using a specific technology, like you're bound by the confines, by the limits of such technology, right? So you cannot go beyond those limits. For me, value, as you said, like something that's like a community that's internally valuable, and you want to have a specific number on money wise, it doesn't, like, for me, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Sometimes it's needed for the thing to continue, but the same way that you wouldn't say like, oh, how much does this community weigh? Because that doesn't really make sense. That's like, you can get a number, but it doesn't really make sense. Like for me, when you put like a monetary value on like a community or like the enrichment of the soul, for me it's kind of the wrong ruler to use to measure the thing, because for me it doesn't like compute. It's not, it's, money is a really good tool that I think doesn't doesn't really apply in those situations, because like for me, just like dividing by zero, it doesn't compute. It doesn't make sense, the proposition. However, like if you want like an economic model to make viable a community, that's a whole different question, I think. And there are like a lot of ways that you can do it. You can say like, okay, each person is going to pay like an X amount, or someone else. Like there are financial models you can apply to ensure these beautiful, valuable things exist. And I'm completely agree with that. But like some things that for you to value something beautiful, like in price or in terms of dollars, like for me doesn't compute. But yeah, it's a really interesting proposition. The way of value and price interrelates, I think, is really, really nice. Yeah, thank you.
That was magnificent. I'm going to give it to Michelle and Javier. As just about to say before Javier left, he's been talking about the
Possibility and the failure of speech. And I almost want to talk about the failure of money, like to be value or price to be value, and use some sort of crazy Derridian economics just because it's Sunday night, it's fun or something. It's also interesting to think there's something about price that coordinates, and there's something about beauty that coordinates, and something about ethics that coordinates. So there's kind of overlap, right? Like there's something about what you believe is good that coordinates action, but you can't necessarily get everyone to agree on, say, your Christian ethics or whatever. And so pricing, the pricing mechanism is a way to coordinate if people don't agree upon the good that simulates the good. And I'm kind of interested between this notion of economics as somehow a simulation of the ethical life that dialectically relates to the ethical life. But that's a live thought. I'm not sure. I'm going to give it to Michelle and then Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, so that was, I'm really, it's a very interesting topic. And I guess I just wanted to say really quick that I feel like it's challenging, like thinking about these communities like Voicecraft and like how to make these economically viable, because I think sometimes there's something that people feel that is like dirty about money. There's something kind of dirty about it, and it's like, well, if we put prices on this, like we all know this is priceless, and so how could we possibly put prices on this sort of stuff? And I guess there's just it's a real tricky question of how to be able to see money not as dirty again or something like that. And maybe it's to see it as the value, not simply the price. But there are pricing mechanisms, but it's just hard or weird, because I think to people who do these types of things, they don't want to seem like they're in it for the money. They're not. They're there for what it actually, the essence of it, right? The value of it. But they also have realities, financial realities, as any one of us do. So anyways, I just wanted to say that it was just more like a passing thought on that, like how we view money, how we orient it. And I'll just say really quick, me and Bethany Tabor, we did a series on on Atlas Shrugged. So we talked a lot about money. We talked a lot about pricing and sort of like different perspectives on money, and like it's Ayn Rand's perspective on money and some of the pitfalls to her philosophy, but some of the strengths. And so if you guys want to check it out, it's on our Anchor podcast. Shameless plug. But anyways, yeah, basically, like how do we not see money as dirty, and then how can we, as these communities, like is it really just going to boil down to like do this on the side and then do day jobs, like blue collar work? Like what do you think? And yeah, just that's what I want to say.
Yeah, I mean, to carry on what Emilio and Michelle are saying, I mean, first thing I wrote in my notes was, and this is from the ethics, right? One of the things that money does, allows us to be communicable things that are incommunicable. So like houses and beds. But it also seems kind of ridiculous. Like the idea, like, let's say a house is $300,000. Are we really saying that the same value is there for, 100 beds? Let's take a bed, like a bed and a bed frame is $3,000. Are we really saying that 100 beds with bed frames is the equivalent of one house? In one sense, yes, because it's the same amount of money to acquire both, but also for one individual, what do you do with them? It's like completely different. It's like your brain twists a little bit from it at the same time. Another note is, by the way, there's lots of different things that have value that monetization can't really put a price on. For example, being 20 minutes from your parents when you have children, for example, having best friends you knew for 30 years or right down the road, having good health. Like if your body not being in dysfunction, of having a healthy body that you can go exercise. What number could you put on that? We certainly know what the costs of sometimes, like, that's my thing. It's like, so it's all like in terms of money is this great coordination thing for certain things. I agree. That's what everyone was talking about, but it's almost like a lot is sheared off the table or off the consideration when you just look at that. But also building on another point is on the central topic here of kind of personal development projects like this, for example, the net, like because we're not paying money to be here. We are certainly paying our time. And it's not like watching a movie time where we're just passively consuming. We are actively participating and generating. So this is a more contributive developmental activity that we are, again, choosing to do in our leisure time. Usually in entrepreneurship, the kind of things, usually value has to be generated first before money can be captured. Before profit's captured, you have to generate value. So normally that requires an accumulation, usually. So the short answer is in terms of like activities like this, like if you do a day job or do something else, well, you need to accumulate either an audience or some other accumulation that gets quantified, and then you have to capture it by a certain percentage. That's usually the apparatus in entrepreneurship to do this. Is it the primary focus? No, it probably shouldn't be, but it's certainly, as Michelle said, it's like we still live lives and these things, money matters. It's not like it doesn't matter. And there's a lot of great structures and mechanisms in finance, like capital has a structure within its compounding interest, for example, has all these internal structures that if you know them, they're amazing. They're basically forces of nature almost. It's kind of a phenomenal thing about them. But there's a lot, if you just, as been pointed out, there's things that actually not discussed by it. And also there's even this issue of, like I said, 100 beds versus one house. It's a lot more. You can make a family with a house. You can't really do that with 300 beds. The best you can do is sell those beds for profit at best, because you don't even need 100 beds. What are you going to do individually with 100 beds? There's that side of the issue. Oh, and I see Michelle's going to sleep in every single one a different day. That's what Michelle's going to do. What's the other note? I mean, I'm sorry, I got distracted from Michelle's body motions over there. But another big thing too is, I even think it's important is that intuition, like as Daniel said, is kind of like that false assumption, like, oh, the price is $200, therefore it's that value. No, because as Amelia said, by the way, the cost of something is relative to how much cash you have. If I have $100 million in my bank account, I don't really care that much for $20. I can really care less. But if I have like $200 in my bank account, it's all I have, and I have no other money coming in, $20 is a significant amount of money. Like it's actually going to be like, it literally goes from air, like nothing in the mind. Like it's just like breathing versus like suffocating. Actually, it's almost breath for life, like the breath of your life almost in that way. When you don't have enough, when you're tight on cash and then something comes up where you have to pay the money in some way. So that's a tension right there. But that's the point. It's like, so the value there is not really necessarily in that price point. It's the available capital of the person who's the consumer who's looking at it. There's also the dynamic of a consumerist behavior of consuming versus contributing. There's that dimension of it. And there's all these other social domains that are not necessarily, they could be monetized. I've heard studies in the monetizing it. It always seems just kind of bizarre, just like the equivalency of saying one house is equivalent to 100 beds is also bizarre. Like, yes, we understand the reasoning behind that, but it doesn't really map on. Something seems to be lacking in the account when we say that. And lastly, just the idea of these intrinsic values. Because by the way, things like this group where you don't even know the outcome. That's also why it's not really a transaction normally, because transactions assume transparent information of knowing what you're getting for the transaction for the most part. At least there's expectation you're going to get something out of it. And then there's a kind of correspondence on that. But this is very different because we don't really know what's going to happen here. We don't really walk into this knowing what's going to develop. Is it going to be good or not? It's a very different category of development, I would say. Anyways, that's all I got for now.
That was excellent, and I want to use that bed example somewhere. That's really good. I'm going to pass it to Hyrud. There was a Pearls Before Swine comic once that I adore,
and it says, you know, when you're young, you have a lot of time, but you don't have money, and the character goes shoot. When you're older, you have a lot of money, but you don't have time, and the guy goes shoot. And it's like, and then when you're like really old, you have lots of time, you have lots of money, but you have 2 bad knees. It's really funny, and I love that comic because it goes to show you how like 3 of the major, I'm not saying they're the only metrics, but like 3 of the main metrics are time, health, and money. And you're basically at all times of the day spending one of those, maybe 2 of them at the same time. Like you're spending your time, and in a sense you're also spending your health, right? Because you're spending your energy and you're spending your youth because you're going through time, or you're spending your time. And really what actually I think gets people in trouble is often we're only taught to think in terms of the money metric, and then as we get older, we're like, oh, I never learned how to use my time well. Oh, I never learned how to take care of my health. And it's like so important to realize that you have to win in all 3 of those areas, not just one. And when I say win, I mean like find a balance or do sufficient relative to what you want to do, blah, blah, blah. But it's so important, I think, to think in terms of time, health, and money, not just one or the other. And the other thing I was going to say is I made that joke on Gnosticism. Yeah, it's like there's either this thing where we say price is dirty and all that matters is money, and that's almost the Gnostic thing where materiality is bad and all that's good is spirit, or you have a kind of, that's what I mean by economic Gnosticism, or you have this kind of like economic materialism, which is there is no such thing as value, there's only price, and value has nothing to do with it. But that's a kind of materialism because there is some sort of connection between value that then gets translated into price and the value you see in the thing, which has an internal resource. And that's where I'm thinking in terms of like moving out of economic Gnosticism, economic materialism, into seeing this connection between the values that you cultivate inside and your willingness to value something that then is somehow reflected into the price. And that then gets into a dialectical structure and stuff like that. And of course, I have to bring in dialectic because I have to reference Hegel, but I'm going to pass it to Mr. Fishman. But we don't even own that possibility, I think, today, because the majority of people have either been trained to think that price is dirty, is like bad, and they're kind of like value is all that matter and the economy is dirty, or they've been trained to think that all that matters is the economy and there is no kind of underlying metaphysical value system that's ethical and aesthetic, as we were alluding to, that needs to be taken care of. But let me pass it to Mr. Fishman.
Okay, so yeah, it's interesting, this relationship between price and value, because like obviously there's a connection between them, but there's obviously a disconnection too, right? Because like diamonds are very expensive, toilet paper is very cheap. But if you ask anybody, would you rather live in a world without diamonds or a world without toilet paper? Everyone's going to say, I'd rather live in a world without diamonds, right? And so I guess the difference is that price is dictated by scarcity, whereas value is not dictated by scarcity, right? Toilet paper is just as valuable when it's scarce as when it's abundant, but the price goes up because you're competing with other people to have that value, right? And so I think that, like, on the one hand, we want to tie price to value, but on the other hand, like, it is a dangerous move because we associate, like, we bring scarcity into it when it doesn't need to be, you know what I mean? And like, as much as I love your idea, Daniel, for like using NFTs to destroy economic Gnosticism and fund these projects, there is also something about like what does it mean to owe somebody something when it's monetary versus non-monetary, right? Like if I get a taxi ride and an Uber driver comes and picks me up and takes me somewhere, I owe him $15 or whatever it is. But if you, as my friend, come and pick me up in my hour of need, I might say I owe you one, right? But that debt never fully gets fulfilled, right? You can't actually pay it back. You have to pay it forward, right? And a debt that is paid forward sticks with you even after you pay it back, right? It builds a bond between you and the other person that paying them monetarily doesn't. And so we do, like, when we start talking about trying to bring monetary compensation to value, which is not directly translatable into economic value, we do run the risk of losing the personal bonding that happens through owing somebody something that can never fully be paid back when you can pay them back. Be like, I don't owe you anything. I paid you back, right? Because like once the Uber driver drops you off, you don't owe them anything anymore, and there's nothing after that, right? You're even. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's a great point. I mean, and to build on that, because the idea of the one even just owing, but the whole idea of vows, right? There's kind of the moral dimension is kind of tied into this, the social bonding quality of it. So not because the thing is also with a friend coming to your time of need is part of fulfilling the vow of friendship, right? And actually reinforce it. Actually, it's almost in a way future proof. It's like the vow actually self-generates the action in the future and fulfills it. So actually, it's an almost. So when we say yes, it's true. I would agree with you that when you, in another sense, you actually just fulfilled the friendship too. Existence to share a story. They were shutting down the gym, and I got locked out of my car with the car running during a blitz, and literally the snow was accumulating like very rapidly. I think in about within like 20 minutes, like probably half a foot of snow showed up. It was crazy. So I called a bunch of people to hopefully save me to get me my spare keys in my house. One of my good friends, Andrew, actually picked up, and he didn't even ask any questions. He had a shit Kia, like this, like the one person I thought he was actually my last person I called because he had the worst car, the car that would not be equipped for the challenge of going through the snow. He did it. He drove to my car house, he got the keys, he came back. That little shitbox Kia came in and he came. And then from like, that's truly a moment in my mind. Like, I'll never be able to pay that back. I feel like in one sense, but in another sense, like I know the friendship of this friend, Andrew, because of that event. Because he came to me in that time of absolute desperation. And actually the time where actually he was the most unfitted to answer the call, but he did anyway. It's kind of amazing in my mind. I just want to share that, just building on what was just said, just to share that.
So, a few things. One, I do not.
So, Mr. Fishman and I had a conversation, and there's the work that Anthony does on an Intrinsic Research Co. on the notion of the possibility of investing directly in value using the NFT mechanism, not say the NFT speculative market involving monkeys that are on yachts or something. That's an entirely different ballgame. But there is something to be said. No one wants to be, say, a monomechanist where there's like a single mechanism of all economic transactions or interactions in human history. You would still have the mechanism of pricing for goods and services. The notion is a mechanism that would deal with horizons and approaches. And indeed, you would still have human to human interactions outside of the internet that would be valued and go accordingly, right? Like if you owe someone, you can never owe them back. Now, I will say it's very interesting. There's also I want to do something for you because I intrinsically value you and I see, beauty in you, and there's like a friendship, right? Like there's a motivation from a place of debt, but then there's a motivation from a place of attraction. And actually very often between friends, when people say I'm indebted to you, they kind of actually almost mean something more like I'm attracted, like I want to be more with you because you're the kind of person that would do this for me. It's not the same, and I know you don't mean it that way. It's not the same as like you owe $1,000 to the bank, right? That's just kind of a cold sort of, oh crap, I can't get out of the country fast enough. I guess I'll have to pay this off. Whereas in a friend, it's like, I now owe you because you've given me a vision of what is possible in life, and I want to return that to you as well, like a vision of like love, for example, right? So the debt is mixed with vision, I kind of would say, in a way, right? And that's where there is a value there. Like there's a value, not just the kind of pricing debt mechanism, right? Like there's a value that is spoken to in the pricing of the debt, right? So both are relating to one another. And I think that's kind of the key. Like when we talk about, like generally speaking, when we're talking about this death of economic materialism or economic Gnosticism, it's about becoming constantly aware that those two things are interrelating with one another. They're always dialectically informing one another. You can never have just pure price without value being there. And you can never have value that is able to then be communally understood and distributed without some sort of pricing mechanism, right? Like if you don't have a way to distribute it, now we can all value something, right? But in order to like make it communicable or to spread it or to make it sustainable, that's when you start getting prices. I'm not saying literally the net. We're talking about other communities that are doing this thing. And the reason, I should note that a reason why this question of the pricing of approach or horizon, I cannot decide what I want to call it. I'll just say approach for now. The reason why this question of the pricing of approach might be so important is because as automation and as AI and all of these things get really freaking good at, say, doing goods and services jobs instead of human beings, one of the things that we will still perhaps be economically, you will still be kind of unique at doing is communities of approach, or human ways of bringing approach to the table, or thinking ethically in terms of values. And if the robots have all the other jobs, then somehow having an economic way to translate the unique human element that humans can bring to the world might become a pressing issue, unless you figure out another way to, say, distribute the goods or the productivity of the robots. Say a UBI, there's a thousand different ways that people think about it, but the urgency of the question may become more and more pronounced as humans move to focus more and more on the things that humans uniquely do, because of the rest of the entire socioeconomic order is being increasingly automated, or increasingly you have the rise of the robots, as Mr. Ford talks about. So that's something of note, of another reason why the question might be interesting. But with that, I'll pass it to whoever likes to speak.
Yeah, it's a really the last point about automatization is really poignant, because the other day, like all these AI models about like DALL-E and all this stuff, like, were already out there, and I always thought like this is really cool. But lately, like OpenAI opened like this, like for the public, and there's this specific like chatbot that's, I think it's been like making the rounds on the web sphere. But for me, it's the key distinction is that for the other ones, you have to be like a little bit technical, I think, to access the technology. But this one is like a chatbot. You can say like, give me a Python script to merge these two Excel sheets, right? So it's just like, it's in a whole nother, and it gives you like functioning code. Or you could say like, according to Plato, what's the ethical way to live a life? And it will give you a short paragraph essay thing that's actually like quite good and reasonable stuff. So the potential of this is really, really interesting. So it's the first time that it has occurred to me that a lot of people could lose a lot of their jobs really fast, because right now you don't need a writer. Like, you can give it a prompt, like have this new thing, like edit a little bit and just polish something, right? So like there's a lot of jobs that it's the first time in my life that I have so clearly seen the way that some jobs are just going to like come up and like evaporate. So that was a really, yeah, so that's a thing that's going to happen. And it comes down to the economic thing, right? Because like for most of our human history, like we have valued like money meant like human energy and time, right? So that when we decouple that the money and the price from it, what do? Like, because the way to get money was to give our time or our energy, and then what we bought was another energy and time of another one. But if that's not the case anymore, if it's a machine, if it's like this human model thing, how is that going to change the pricing mechanism we use to receive the things? And pricing also in the sense that, yes, of the things we buy, but also of the price or the amount of money we receive, right? Because that's it also like a two-way street, because price is not only something you could say that your salary is the price of your price as a laborer, right? That could be, you could think about it that way. So that price is also going to change. And it's weird because like most as the story with the friendship and friends, it's really interesting because this kind of debt with another one with this friendship, it's weird. And sometimes I think we are like, I don't know if that's a product of our time, but we're so focused on making like on thinking in economic terms, and that it sometimes comes counterproductive, because there's this book that's called Drive. It talks about motivation and stuff. And in one thing that's really interesting is that there was this kindergarten place, and some parents came late, right? So that was not like fair for the teachers. So they implemented a policy that's like, if you arrived X amount of minutes late, you will pay a fee. And you would say like, in the rational economic mind, you would say like, oh, that will deter people from actually arriving late. No, the tardiness doubled because now it's an economical transaction. If you value it like, oh, of course I need to pay like $10 extra if I can get like an extra half an hour to pick up my children. It becomes an economic calculation. And beforehand, you were like, oh, I don't want to inconvenience the teachers. It's not like you felt this social bond, this social connection. So you try to be on time. But when it became like an economic transaction, like that disappeared. So I think that's also like a clear example of how this all plays out. And another thing about price and value is that even like if you ask a marketer, like how do you sell something, they would say like value, the perceived value has to be higher than the price, right? Because that's like if something is priced at $20 but you value it at 10, then you won't buy it, right? So that's all. Some thoughts about the interplay between value, money, and everything like that. And just and as last thought is that for me, we've said that money is a technology for social coordination. The pricing mechanism leaves a lot of things out that don't really fit into the logic and the way of measuring it. And I think that money is really cool. It has allowed us to come all this far. It's a really nice tool of coordination, but I think it shouldn't be the only one. I think if we are open, but it's really weird because the more when someone tries to value something in terms that it's not like in numbers, it becomes really fuzzy, really weird, really hard to like coordinate. It's because I think we're not accustomed to, but I think it's possible in the sense that, for example, we could have like a time economy instead of money, like a strict exchange of time, but also like a resources economy, but not in a bartering kind of way, but resources that kind of, for example, a common garden that we tend to, right? And everyone keeps a little bit of, I don't know, of fertilizer or something and shovel. So I think if we come with a new technology of social coordination, it won't be able to do things that money does well. I don't know how well it can scale, for example, because money is really good at scale, like social coordination at scale and big projects. But I think that for these type of things, that like communities and all these projects, there's a really impactful and concrete way of organizing that doesn't involve money, that actually fulfills the objective of the role or the presence of the community. And I think it would just change, like if we had the question, how would we organize if money didn't exist? I think that's the question I used to guide my thinking into ways of different coordination, because and it's weird and difficult and really fun and interesting. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
That's outstanding. And first, Daniel Pink is great. We actually talked about his
book on regret pretty recently, which was fascinating on intrinsic motivation. I think it's the Chat GPT that you're talking about that I just recently ran into. That is freaky. That's a freaky stuff right there, man. You can like ask for it to give you a dialogue or debate between Dostoevsky and Girard, and you're like, oh, that's really good. Now, it's kind of soulless, but all you got to do is like, I got to write something tomorrow. You put it in and then you just edit afterwards to add that human flair. That's what's going to happen. And then, yeah, so how much is an article is that article worth? If you can just have the CPT, the people will become skeptical of it, right? You say, well, no, it wasn't written. And then everything gets confused. And then I'll pass it to Mr. The last thing I was going to say that's interesting to me is you made a very important point where you say when we try to value something without price, it's kind of weird. Like you say, what do you think the hammer is worth? But don't put it in terms of price. It's kind of difficult. It's also difficult, though, if I just give you a price and I said, this is the price is $20 and no phenomenon to connect it to. It's also weird. You're like, what does that mean? It's weird, right? So it's interesting that the weirdness vanishes when you put them together. Like you put the phenomenon together with a price. If you have just a phenomenon, it's like very difficult to determine its value. But if you just have a price, it's very difficult to determine if that price is accurate. So there's like an interplay that goes on that's kind of interesting. But that's just something that came to mind, and I'll pass it to Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, kind of actually, I mean, Amelia, about that one story about the school charging for tardiness and at doubling the effect. So it's of tardiness. So it sounds like the solution should have been to shame them more. So you need to basically, you got to lean in on the shame aspect then, because that's what I'm pointing out. There's different like levers of value, and if economic value measured by dollars doesn't pull it off, then the other option, I would say very obviously the next move is shame. So right, even do it like I teach, so trust me, that's a lever we use all the time. Probably one of my favorite examples of when if a student starts talking in a class is the stop talking and just look at the student as they're talking. And then they quickly realize this, the two students talking, they realize what's just occurred. They breathe, like, look, like, oh no. Very powerful stuff. Anyway, so no, I mean, these are very important social, by the way, like this, we're kind of laughing about it, but it's also, these are very important social biological forces, because social cohesion, you didn't have it, you're dead, basically. I mean, you're going to die if you're ostracized from your community. So we're kind of laughing about it because we're not obviously putting a parent on the spot for their kid being late. And I would just riffing up the idea, if they're young enough, like delaying the entire program until that parent shows up with their kid, and like making it very clearly obvious that everything stopped because you didn't show up. I think that'd be my mechanism for strategies like that. So you just lean in on the shame factor. But the point is like because there's a value there of social cohesion that you can manipulate on, you can push on, that is actually a very important trigger. It's just actually even more, actually in some ways more important than money. Like, again, isolated island, I can give a shit how much money you have. I need to make sure the social group stays together so we don't die, for example. Just ripping off a point. Something Daniel said though about the vows and the moral and friendship not being a debt in the same way of like I owe you, like we went on, like I did something for you, you owe me something, but the desire for the good, it's very Aristotelian. It's very much like that's the value of true virtue. Friendships are built on virtue, because literally the friend is a like reflective mirror onto for oneself of a good presented in front of you. As a vision, right? So basically a contemplation of the truth or goodness or things like that. I think that's actually a really powerful, I think there's a really important value in that. And especially this kind of, as opposed to the commerce's modes where it's very much a transaction where you're lacking. And by the way, I'm reading Plato right now. One of my most fascinating readings from him is his argument of predication based on excessive lack. It's fascinating. Or he uses excessive desire. That's what he uses as the example. It's very fascinating. So like a glutton is someone whose gluttonous is because they have excessive desire for food, right? Et cetera, et cetera. I can give you a bunch of different examples. Even the philosophers are lovers of wisdom, they desire wisdom, right? Because they're desirous of it. They have an excessive desire for this thing called wisdom. It's very fascinating. Obviously, we can challenge that argument, that account, but it's I'm just building off what Daniel's pointing out here, is that kind of desire that we're talking about for the friend. And by the way, this friend could also be a wife, anything that's like of the divine or the virtuous kind of relationship. It's this kind of desired for the excessive in the excessive mode, almost a lacking way, like in our discussions of lack, having kind of a existence more than what they have in front of them. Anyway, so just want to build those points. That's all.
No, that was lovely. I'm going to give it to Mr. Fishman and Michelle. And another way to put that debt point is the way I think about it is it's kind of like, if you marry, like if you're doing Beethoven's Ninth and you're the string section, there's a sense in which you're indebted to the pianos to come in at the right time. But there's also like, it's a sense of that's what we need to do to create the music. It's like a debt that's tied to the creation of some sort of beauty of the friendship. And so it's like, I owe you the right timing. And I'm using that in honor of Javier. It's like, I owe you to be there when you need me to do, so that the work you're doing like adds to the string section and we make the entire music. So there's a sense in which there's an O, but it's an O relative to what arises out of the dancing together, the playing together, the coordination together. And it's tied to a certain, it's almost like the debt is to the beautiful itself.
Like it's to the creation of something beautiful in the arising, or the fittingness is kind of like it has to fit together. So there's a sense in which that language works, but tying it to the beauty, and then I'll pass it. And there is also another topic that we could get into is Michelle and I did a paper called Aesthetics and Ethics on how what we find beautiful tends to emergently coordinate action to treat it, say, with care, or to observe it or to witness it because we find it beautiful. And so then like aesthetics naturally generates ethical behavior. Now you have to define what you mean by that, but that's a thought too. But let me give it to Mr. Fishman and then we'll give it to Michelle.
Okay, so yeah, just to build on what you guys are saying here, I'm reminded of this story. I don't know if this is a true story or not, but it illustrates my point either way. There's a story about a guy who goes into the Amazon or somewhere and he finds this like uncontacted tribe who's living a very primitive lifestyle, and he befriends them and ends up bringing one of the tribesmen back to the city with him and tries to sort of explain to him modern life and tries to explain to him how money works, right? And he explains that you get money in exchange for your time, and then you can use money to buy other things. And so this tribesman is trying to get his head around like, okay, how many hours would I have to work to get this or that thing? And he keeps asking him this, right? How many hours would I have to work to get this hammer? An hour, whatever. And he says like, how long would I have to work to get a house? And he's like, 30 years or something, right? And he's like, whoa, that's crazy, right? In our community, like when somebody needs a house, we just get together and we build them a house, and it takes a week, and then that's it, right? And then we walk away, and then the next time somebody needs a house, the community gets together and we do it again, right? And so it speaks to what you're saying here about how like we relate to an economic decision very differently than we relate to a decision that has to do with our family and our community and our tribe, right? And it seems like money allows us to scale through space, because like if you're not going to go and build a house for the tribe across the river, right? Because they're not your people, because they're never going to pay you back. Like it's all the whole idea of like you give to the tribe and the tribe gives back to you. It's all about spreading the transaction across time, right? But with money, you can go and build a house for the tribe across the river, and they'll just pay you, and then you can walk away and you don't have to see them ever again, and you feel justified in that transaction, right? So it seems like monetary transactions allow us to scale commerce through space, and non-monetary transactions allow us to scale commerce through time. And so maybe, I don't know, that's just kind of what I thought of listening to you guys.
I am extremely interested on the point, and I think it's true that there's something about money that enables scale and spread. The reason I think this is interesting because we've talked in a lot of net conversations about the problem of spread or scale, and like this notion of to avoid, say, Deleuzian capture, the Deleuzian apocalypse, the meta crisis, there's some need to say scale absolute knowing. If you just grant this language, I know we have to go through it, but we've talked, then is there some way to add the mechanisms that create absolute knowing to a pricing mechanism of which would then enable it to spread, right? And that would be the question of the problem of horizon or approach that I keep talking about. Like if there is no way to enter approach into a pricing mechanism, then it is difficult to imagine the possibility of solving the problem of spread or the problem of scale with absolute knowing. And that's been a question that has come up in the net. And if it can't be solved, there might not be a way to address, say, the meta crisis. Now, obviously, all of that requires the context of the conversation, but it's a reason why I think this topic is so interesting. I'm also reminded quickly by that story. Bernard would tell the story, and I thought it was hilarious. It was really great. So there's this guy fishing. And this guy comes along, he's, man, you're really good at fishing. You ought to start a company. And he's like, oh, yeah? And he's like, yeah, you should start a company. And, he's like, what should I do? Well, you should buy some boats. He's like, okay. He's like, yeah, and you buy some boats, and then you can buy 5 boats. He's like, okay. And he's like, why would I want to do that? Because then you'll make more money. He's like, oh, well, I want to do that because then you'll be able to hire people. He's like, oh, yeah, I'll be able to do. He's like, yeah, and you hire people. And why do I want to do that? Because then I'll make lots of money. He's like, well, why do I want to make lots of money? Yeah, because when you get older, you'll be able to retire and fish all day.
Oh, okay. It's like there's this idea that the person already has the value they need, or there's an efficient way to get that value that's being overlooked because you're so plugged into the economic model, right? Like you could have the community come together and build the house, and then you wouldn't be in debt for 30 years, but you're so siloed into the economic system and the way that the system does it that you don't even think of that possibility, which to me raises the question. This is something I kind of think about. If there is indeed, if indeed there is a dialectic between price and value, as opposed to one or the other, I actually think that losing sight of this is why I think economic Gnosticism or economic materialism one of the reasons it's so problematic, is that I think losing sight of that dialectic actually makes us less rational economically. It actually leads to everyone talks about the efficient market hypothesis or whatever. Like if you actually don't see this relation as dialectical, you're going to be less efficient, because you're going to do less efficient things, because you're going to turn to prices when you should actually turn to values. So you're going to misallocate your time or your resources by not seeing a dialectical relationship and just thinking it's one or the other. And so I wonder if it actually affects efficiency. But let me pass it to Michelle.
Really great stuff, guys. So many wonderful thoughts. I just had two quick things. I really thought that was interesting, Thomas, when you're talking about like the classroom and shame and everything like that. And it got me thinking about how I think that money seems to be like, it really taps into this like incentive structure, right? This like these rewards, and if you do this, you get $5. And I mean, not that you do this in teaching or anything like that, but you get what I'm saying. Like it's like, well, grades can be another example, right? Like you do this on this project, or you do this, you get this. This is your reward, or this is like what you achieved, or this is what measures what you did with your time, if you actually were productive, your commission, things like that. And so it got me thinking, because it makes me think of like some things like in like conscious parenting world, where it talks a lot about like making rewards and consequences very related to the actual thing that you want to correct, right? Or you want to teach. So I wonder though if money, though it has a lot of great ways in which it can do this whole incentivizing and rewarding, it's also not directly related to like, okay, you can't take money and you can't eat money. You can't eat money, right? You can't, like, you could, if you had a bunch of money, you could start a fire and bring your game back from your hunt, and then you could eat. But like, you can't, it's just, we often assume that it has value, but it doesn't really, you can't really, it doesn't do, the money itself does really nothing, right? It's just this kind of social construct, like Emilio pointed out, like we agree that this is what you can do with it. And so sometimes I wonder, like, if our disconnection with survival, like if our disconnection, I know it seems like, I don't mean to sound grim or something, but just the realities of life, yeah, somebody's doing something so you can eat that food today, or whatever, like that I'm eating right now, like there's all these things that we lose touch with it so much, quite literally our touch. We don't touch barely anything that is like part of the production of our foods and things that then we eat and consume. And so I just wonder, like, what we do have touch with is money itself. We touch it, we put it, we put it away. I don't know. Now we don't, like, we're getting so much more cashless right now. It's just like this little plastic card or, whatever. But that's a whole nother tangent. But the main point is, like, I'm trying to kind of think about this distance. It's a symbol, right? It's a token. That's quite literally a token for something. So I wonder if it kind of makes us sometimes not as aware as we might need to be of like death and surviving and things like that, because we get this illusion that, well, it's like, okay, so giving a big plug because I need to, because this is amazing. There's this musical podcast called In Strange Woods, and it's incredible. It's incredible. And I loved it so much that I all want you to go and watch it. I mean, I'm not even like a huge musical person. Like, I love musicals, but I'm not like, I wasn't like a theater kid, though I love theater kids. They're a lot of my friends, but but I love this. This was like so good. The writing was so good. The music was so good. And it's on Apple Podcast. So In Strange Woods, you can find it there. But one of the things in this is that it's talking about the fact that none of us know how to survive in the wild, really. I mean, like, how many of us could survive really out in the wild because something happens related to that, a tragedy in the woods. And so basically, it's like, well, what's your, and we've talked about this, but it's like, what's your money going to be able to do for you now? What's your phone going to be able to do for you now? and it's like nothing. I know nothing. It's like no cell service. The money's just, it's in my pockets, giving me like a centimeter more of like, padding to my, pocket to keep me warm. So basically just, this disconnect is good in a way, because it gives us all this sort of like leverage, if you will, but it's also concerning a little bit, because it's like we don't know so much of what money does for us. We don't know how to do it. Like the tribesmen you mentioned, Hairut, like they got together and built a house because they can. How many of us could build a house from a foundation? And I'm not saying like, oh, we should all feel really bad because we can't do these things, but it's strange because money now makes it so we don't really have to, which is good in some ways because we can use our time for other stuff. But at the same time, so that was not really a very completed thought, but it just was some ideas.
No. You plugged in Strange Woods. That's very important, and everyone should watch that.
That made it successful.
Hello, Haven. So that's my. It's funny as you were saying, Michelle. It made me think how also there's a way in which money. So money removes from us, or can remove from us the. Money can remove from us a failure to realize how difficult it is to get food or to survive. I also wonder if there's a sense in which money makes us lose sight of how difficult it is not to get bored, or to say cultivate the virtues of the soul, as Mr. Joachim was saying. Because you see all these people who retire or who have lots of money in the bank account, and it doesn't do anything for them, right? You mentioned how you can't eat money. Now, I would say it depends on the recipe, or if you're doing a magic trick in high school and you're trying to make a dollar bill disappear. And anyway, so, there's also something where when your money's in your bank account, it can't make you see life beautiful or be motivated or want to do something. And so it's kind of interesting too, because as you were talking, I was thinking about how money also can't give you interest, being interested in money, which is funny because money gives you interest, right? You put it in the bank and you give interest, but it actually can't give you interest for your soul or the ability to be interested, or it can't give you a friend. And yet it's precisely in that case, whereas the point you're making comes out in the lack of money. If you couldn't buy food or if you couldn't buy a house, then you're like, oh, I need to make one and I can't. Oh, that sucks. In this example, the excess of money unveils that you're incapable of, say, cultivating your own soul or finding interest. Whereas I would say, you could say, well, wait a minute, couldn't that happen if you didn't have money? Well, what actually tends to happen if you don't have money, then you're busy trying to figure out how to survive. So that kind of distracts you from the lack of internal resources or different things. Just like someone like Durkheim warned that it's first world nations that tend to have suicide problems because you're not bound by the very necessity of everyday life. So it's interesting how money in its excess can show you how difficult it is to cultivate the abilities of the soul or to fight boredom or things. So it was interesting. That was I was thinking as you spoke. But
I just wanted to share that what you said, Michelle. For me, it's really actually that's one of the main one of the main things I think about, because we always hear it, right? Capitalism sucks, it's horrible. That we always hear it, but I always think what's the alternative, right? And and capitalism is this huge beast that swallows every attempt to try to defeat it. So it's really hard. So the thing that I thought about was that, okay, the only way to beat it, to have a limitation, is to take money out of the equation, right? So how would you organize, and how would you do all these things? And I think that I mentioned the idea a little bit when we had our talk, Daniel, but for me is money is this token, this symbol, and it lets you do all this really cool stuff, right? It lets you have a phone and stuff. So, and I think that's really fine, and it's really interesting because if you have a phone, you can listen to beautiful podcasts, right? So it's a win-win. But at the same time, if we go to the forest, we don't know how to survive. So there's a disconnect and the point of survival, right? I think the foundation is not solid. We build all these beautiful, amazing things on top, but the foundations are not solid. So the way I think about it is that, okay, and this is just a random idea, but the way I've been thinking about it is that there are a lot of intangible things you need to have a good life, right? Friends and stuff. But if we talk about material things that you have to have for those things to happen, there would be like, I thought like food, shelter, no, like house and water, right? Those would be the main three things. And it's and when I think about social ways of coordination, I always think that they would feel really weird because we are not accustomed to, because when you have money, you can plug it into this infrastructure and you can do all these things. You can have like with 10, 20 bucks, you can go to the cinema, or you can go to a restaurant, or you can like rent a bicycle, or you can like take a train. So you with like 20 bucks are like, it lets you do like so many different, like the potential of action is like really big, right? But if you don't have money, if you just have, if you do, like for example, if you're in a community and you build a house, like the things that community can do for you are limited, right? They can help you build your house, or but they're like more limited. So in a sense, it's difficult to give up this huge, amazing potential that you can do anything. And if you become a millionaire, you can have a private jet, or you can even go to space right now. So like the entitled, like if you have enough money, you can do all these things, and it becomes this really hard notion to ignore or to let go of. But I think like at least a middle ground, it would be that for the way I thought about it is that like most of our food like gets is not like, we don't think about food, and I think it would be a interesting idea, kind of like what the solar punk movement like proposes. And I think they have like practical, like actionable ideas, and I think those are really cool. Like for example, one of them is that if you live in like in a with like in a street or in a like neighborhood or something, like instead of just having like a lawn on the outside, that you plant like vegetables and fruit. Like if you plant actual like food there, and then you can like coordinate, and you can even go to your neighbor and say like, would you let me plant this in your lawn? I will tend for it. I will like do all this thing. And like with the passing of time, it can become like a communal garden, like a commons type of thing, and that everyone takes like I don't know if there's like a papaya or like a banana, or like all the, or maybe you planted like nuts or strawberries or something, and then it becomes, I think life would become like more like richer and interesting, because the one of the things I like thought about is that if this system like evolved far enough, like let's say that we like almost like decentralized farming, in the sense that, for example, you have this little plot of land here, and a little like, and this little plot of land here, like all dispersed throughout the city, and like the citizens actually like are the ones that tend to the soil themselves. Like that, let's say like one, almost if it was like a civic duty, like it's just like a common thing that one day a week each person goes to one of these plots of land and like farms and toils and all, does all these things, right? And imagine if we, and the beauty of this is there would be like no money involved, at least in your operation, because buying a plot of land like takes money. You cannot escape the system without like participating or initiating from it first. So to start, like someone would have to buy the plot of land. So you still need money, you just need capital. But then the way of system like I've envisioned is that, imagine that the only thing you have to do is to participate like one day a week, and then you have like food, because if this system like builds big enough, then you would not have to worry about like money and food, because you would not get stressed out losing your job, because you know you are going to have food. Like the mechanism by which you survive is different by the mechanism which you participate in all these cool things money gives you, right? So if you have this operation, if you have this mechanism that I work this once a week, and I'm going to be able to feed myself for the rest of my life, I just have to work this one day. You could even say like, okay, like I can work, or I can choose to work in something that gives me more time, or you could say like, I'm like, I want to conquer the world, and I'm going to be like a super successful like entrepreneur, and that's fine. And you're always like, and you're always certain that even if you make a risky business move, you are still going to be able to feed yourself. So I think that's that for me, it's I think that, just as an example, right? Just to run through the example that I have thought about, like those type of coordination would not involve money. it would mainly involve time. There would be like a common resource, like the common plot of land and things. But I think those type of like social coordination systems are, I think we could aspire to something towards that, and we could minimize the worst aspects of money. So that's just kind of an idea of an example. If we run through the question is how would we social organize, at least for the essential stuff, without money? And I think there are ways to do it, and I think those are really interesting and could actually exist. But yeah, that's like a thought. Yeah.
Well, this is the part where I mentioned something about the garden that Mr. Fishman works about, and you two talk together, because that's outstanding. There is definitely something about the lack of one to leverage a negotiation against their employer, with their employer, if they do not have something to fall back on. That's why a lot of, say, unions will have union food banks, they'll have union housing, they'll have like a treasure trove. Like right now, there's a giant rails mining strike, I think it's Alabama, where it's been going on for like 8 months. And one of the reasons it might be successful is precisely because there's something to fall back on, right? Now, there at the same time is the tension where the owners of the company are like, hey, inflation, steel prices are up and our margins are being killed, and we don't really have a choice. And you're going to probably see a lot of this occurring in the tech companies as you get more and more layoffs, as if the market goes into tightness. So it's kind of this double bind where sometimes we have to be understanding, where the company is like, we can't do this. But then there's also a danger of the employees not having any leverage in negotiation because they have nothing to fall back on, right? Well, both sides of that means there's a higher likelihood of inefficiency in negotiation, of which would lead to what we would have reason to think is the most optimal outcome between both parties, right? If you have those external pressures, whether it be an unreliable macro picture, which causes inefficiency, or the lack of a net of some kind to fall back on. Now, people would say, well, that's exactly why you create the welfare state and different things. And that would get into the question of, does that work? Does it have the function? And that would actually get into the technicals of the policy itself. And you might also, Michel Bon, he works on the commons question, which is very interesting. He had a conversation with Cadell and has some works. I'm also wondering, as we've been talking, on like Heidegger in metaphysics, getting to the technology and kind of being the end of metaphysics, is there something about where it's a live thought, where value and kind of ethics moves into price has an incentive to then create technology, and then through that ends up in the standing reserve that Heidegger kind of talks about, how it's almost like economics and technology is how that transition occurred, where the metaphysics, like classical metaphysics, leads for Heidegger into where everything is reduced into standing reserves. Now, I would also say that everyone should check out Mr. Jockin's conversation with Dr. Nieberhauser on that. And I also think Mr. Jockin has a lovely review of ontological design on this question. But there is something, well, to me, I guess I bring that up because I wonder if losing sight of the dialectic between price and value contributes to the slippage of value in a philosophical sense into value in an economic sense, separate from that philosophical sense, that then turns it into just pure economic exchange, which then is optimized in technology, which then leads to everything being turned into standing reserve. And I wonder if that movement of value into the standing reserve that Heidegger talks about can be better fought with a dialectical relationship between price and value, because then you'd always have to have a sense of the human metaphysical valuation. And then the question would be, where does that come from? And what's the source of that? And how does that work? And that would get you into classical thought like Aristotle and essence and things like that we talk about. So keeping in mind that dialectic could potentially increase the efficiency of avoiding the standing reserve. So that was a thought I had as well.
Brought up standing reserve, I have to jump in now. I mean, you can't, how can I resist? Because fundamentally, right, I think Heidegger's greatest idea about that was, just to quickly summarize, the main idea was the basically fungibility. Like, what does money do? It's basically the idea of fungibility, right? So $1 is equal to another dollar, doesn't matter. The fungibility of basically entire standing reserves of resources. So the examples always used is the river being dammed up, and then sort of energy that, as opposed to having some explicit use where, say, you make a little mill to grind the wheat, it's very explicit what the conversion of energy was used for. You know what it is used for. It's very explicit. but just store it up as just energy in a dam for any indefinite use. That's what's being brought out here. I think it's actually very accurate because, you know, our examples we've been talking about friendship and these social bonds, they're really messy and very very low resolution on the ground. Because, for example, my story, my best friend coming to save me, and that bond of friendship being made with that, it's individuated to us. There is no other person I can have that relationship with. And in fact, I would actually be like it would be like shocking to ask me to swap it out. It's actually partly why, you know, to be honest with you, I think it's not an issue. I think arguments of saying, well, we should be equivalently charitable to all human beings. So this is an argument why we should be just as morally upset if my best friend's starving to death versus a child in, you know, Asia, for example. You know, the arguments can be made, but I think we all can agree that partly why we would revolt against it is what we're getting at here. The moral bonds that have been generated are individuated and very much not standing reserve. They are not indefinite, and they are not fungible and transferable. So actually, I like what Daniel is bringing up here, because I think it's a very important detail that the aspects of social life that are not just, quite frankly, turning on electricity, turning on the flowing water, right, these material things, but instead the social relationships, when those are put into standing reserve, which Heidegger did point out, things like human resources, for example. I mean, that was before OnlyFans and Tinder and all these these standing reserves of social relationships for sexual desire and interactions, and now for basically every social interaction possible. As we've seen by examples of more isolated individuals, less family communal bonds. Basically, you know, the most common attitude I think people are going to have is they're going to be in assisted living facilities, right? With maybe some worker who comes in and sees them once a week, something like that. These are literally fungible people coming to treat you. And I actually know this from personal experience, my family, my father has some health issues, and it's a known issue. He wants his family taking care of him. He does not want nurses taking care of him. And this is what he's getting at, is that these nurses they don't care about him, or they only care about him in the sense they were required to as part of their contract for the job, as opposed to the care of his caretakers of the family. We have a relationship with him as non-fungible. It's a very different dynamic. So I'm trying drawing out this picture to see. I'm a little more, I don't know if I'm pessimistic, Daniel, of the argument that the dialectic we can resolve this, but I think it's more important just knowing that you can't pull Elon Musk of just thinking everything's going to be just commodified quantities, because there's certain social relationships that if you try to do this fungible standing reserve treatment to, it just feels very alien and divorced. And I think I'm trying to draw out that picture.
Oh,
That's
sure,
what I got from that. Thank you,
no, a dialectic in the sense, I mean, it's not a synthesis where you can say that you actually have to keep them as independent and as themselves of what they are, relating but never reducible to one another. Like the dialectic cannot be a reducible thing. It actually has to be a forever active tension. Right? The moment you start saying, oh, we can just figure out a way, the real trick, this is the problem with the pricing of horizons. Like when you start talking about that, it would only work if the pricing is at the simultaneously in service of the value of the event, of the human element, which that's the whole problem. That's why it is so difficult, because it has a tendency to kind of suck it in, right? And then try to treat human relate. That's why it is so difficult. Because, it's funny, like I mentioned that and then I'll give it to Highroot and then whoever wants to speak. Like we mentioned earlier, this kind of weird thing where you try to like value something without price, and it's really hard. But then if I said if you just had price, it would be really weird too. But if you had to choose between those two, which would you prefer? Oh, I'd rather have something I couldn't price than just having some weird number that wasn't connected with anything, right? That would be an easy choice. So we all have an intuitive sense that it is better to have a event, I'm using Javier's language now, to have an experience that even if we can't price, that experience is somehow in its very fullness of being an experience better than just some autonomous price that you can't link to anything.
But what's so strange is the brain, though, almost would prefer the numbers. Like naturally, like it has a like gravity toward the quantifiable, which we have to kind of fight. We'll be like, no, 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 brain. It's sometimes good to just accept things you can't fully understand, because when you understand, you might reduce them, right? So right there, to me, is actually a dialectical tension, because you have to fight the quantifying tendencies of the brain and actually to kind of accept the full quality of life, right? And so that's part of the whole problem, is the moment you get prices involved in anything, there's a danger. There's a risk, because it has a tendency, like a cancer almost, to grow and then take over the whole thing. But then if you just say, well, that the way we can avoid that is getting rid of price entirely, well, then because it's dirty, well, that's where I'm talking about this kind of Gnosticism almost. It's kind of dirty, and that in one way that solves some of your problems, but then it opens up other problems because you don't have this mechanism of coordination. So this is why this problem, I think, is so difficult. It is a profound problem. And in some regard, and there's absolutely a sense in which you say, well, that's why there are some things we don't want to have a pricing mechanism, right? I don't want to say necessarily have sitting on the porch with my neighbor or Michelle priced. That's not what we want to do, right? You're always going to have, Michelle Boas will talk about the necessity of having some areas of social life that are commons, meaning they are outside the pricing mechanism, because that actually becomes kind of a source of moral engine, or a kind of you need to have some part of it, right? The problem becomes, like the reason why the problem of approach is even worth, I think, considering, is precisely because of, one, the automation I mentioned, two, these communities coming into existence, three, the problem of spread that we've talked about with absolute knowing, and four, the sustainability of those things, right? And that's why it's kind of a problem of considering, not because one wants to become like all ubiquitous. That word is hard, omnipresent, not because one wants that, but because it is addressing those cases that are becoming very, I think, pressing as these online enterprises or different things emerge.
Okay, so it seems to me like we're kind of circling around the relationship between having money and being secure, right? Money and security. And like what Michelle was saying, you can't eat money, right? Cannot eat money. And yet you can use money to buy food, right? And so it reminds me of Hegel's master-servant dialectic, right? Which I was just learning about. I've never read Hegel, so I might be wrong here, but I think what he was getting at was the idea that like if you have a master and a servant, then the master is secure because he can tell the servant to go do something, and the servant will do it because he has money or power over him. But then the servant, by doing what the master says, learns how to do things and becomes secure in that he's able to do things, right? And eventually that makes him more powerful than the master, because then he can go and do whatever the master was ordering him to do on his own, and he doesn't need the master anymore. So the master always needs the servant. The servant doesn't always, in the end, doesn't need the master, and ultimately becomes more powerful, right? More successful. And so, yeah, there is definitely an interesting relationship between money and security. And there, like this, we see this all the time with like celebrity culture, right? We'll see people who are very wealthy, who have a lot of money, but they're very insecure. And I think it has to do with this, that they realize the disparity between their power as having money so as to command other people, and their power in actually being able to do things for themselves, right? And there's a sense in which one detracts from the other. And so, yeah, and also like security, as we're talking, like Emilio's talking about, wouldn't it be nice if we had some sort of security underneath our sort of jobs? And like, this though is where like money becomes very useful too, right? Because like I'd be interested to talk to you, Emilio, about your proposal for these communal gardens, because there's a lot of issues that money solves here. You know what I mean? Like, how do you avoid the tragedy of the commons? You're talking about building commons. The tragedy of the commons is a very real thing. You know what I mean? So like either you have to limit this to a small number of people who can participate, and then there's also questions of like hierarchy, like who decides what to put in the garden. And there, I mean, also a garden is not merely a one-time investment in land. There's a continual need for fertilizer and new plants and so on and so forth. And so money deals with all of these problems, and it creates a kind of security in that, like, you don't need to be best friends with your boss and your coworkers. You know what I mean? Like there is another kind of security of like, we're all here to do a job and we're doing this to get paid, but in that we know why we're here and we're not bullshitting each other that we're doing it for some touchy-feely kind of reason, right? Like there's a clarity in like, I'm doing this job for this amount of money and that's it, and we walk away, right? And so anyways, yeah, it's got me thinking about money and security, I think is kind of what we're getting at here.
I really like the language of security, and I like how you brought the master slave dialectic into that, because indeed there's something about money
kind of being the master. But if you can learn to like live without money, there's a way in which you have security, right? And it's like you're better than money in that way. So that's a really interesting connection, and I appreciate that. And I like the idea of you're secure if you don't need money, right? Whereas if you have it, you're not as secure. And yet, funny enough, we tend to associate having money with being secure, right? Oh, you want to have a secure living. So that's a very lovely inversion there. The other thing I was going to say is in one paper, there's this idea that the smaller the community is, the more that it can coordinate by mere negotiation or just conversation. Like if it's really small, you can negotiate. But as it scales, it tends to need to be programmed, precisely because you introduce more personality types with more differences, more different value sets, and different things like that. And the more the thing is programmed, the more it works without you. Like it doesn't need the human element. It works without the human element. Whereas in negotiation, it needs the human element to work because it's based on negotiation. The beauty of negotiation is that it requires the human element. So it's more human, right? It has it there. But the problem with the negotiation is that it requires the human element to work. It requires people to like pull their stuff, right, and to work together. The beauty of programming is that it works without people. It doesn't need people to work. The horror is that it doesn't need people to work, right? And you see what ends up happening is as you scale, you tend to have to move from negotiation to program. Right? Because you need to have it less dependent on individuated humans, because that becomes too complex and it doesn't quite work. Right. So what has happened, unfortunately, is as say capitalism or economics has scaled, it has moved in a more program direction away, whereas commons can be negotiation based. And then in that very movement to program based, there tends to be a losing sight of the relation between value and price to then just treat price as value. Like there is no metaphysical dimension behind it. There's just the price, right? And with that sort of slippage, with that sort of amnesia, then you get the standing reserve, then you get the loss of the intrinsic value of, say, friendship or of ethics or these different connections, which then leads to something dehumanizing. And the trick seems to be this great problem of the possibility of scale, but not having that slippage occur. That seems to be what's so difficult, is to have scale without that slippage or using sight of the relation of value and price as opposed to the replacement of value by price, or the more anti-capitalist tendency of saying price is dirty and we just want value. Well, if you're going to just have value, then you're talking tribes and small. That's going back to just negotiation. That's inherently small. And maybe it's better to be small. I'm very, Leopold Koh's book, The Breakdown of Nation, is pretty grand. Communitarianism, some of that thinking, Jonathan Rout's is pretty grand. I live on a farm, I see it. But one also has to appreciate the trade-offs of that. And then ultimately, if you're talking like the context of, say, the meta crisis or global warming or all these other big global things that people talk about, the solution of going small back to a negotiation element may not be adequate for dealing with large interconnected problems and different things like that. Now, maybe it is, right? That would have to be a different conversation. But I think that's kind of the crux of, not the only crux, but that's part of the crux of the issue. But gentlemen, I appreciate you coming out on a Sunday night and speaking. This has been a lot of fun. It's so good to see you, Thomas. I really think you're a beautiful person. Emilio, thank you for being here. I appreciate Mr. Fishman, Highroot. Thank you for talking about economics again. I really appreciate that. Mr. Highroot inspired a long paper, and I have so many notes. But anyway, thank you so much. You're beautiful people. I hope you all have a good one.